Hi guys, and welcome to my course on Introduction to ASP.NET Core MVC, and we'll be using .NET 5. I have seen many people struggle with the concept of MVC or getting to know how .NET Core is different as compared to classic .NET. Do not worry, I have you covered if you need an introduction on what are the basic files and folders in a .NET Core project, or how do you add database to the project, how do you connect with Entity Framework Core, and much more. Before you take this free course, I want you to be familiar with basics of C# and have a basic understanding of how SQL queries work and SQL Server. If you have that, then this course will be easy to follow along. Before I walk you through what will be covered in this free course, I would appreciate if you would like and subscribe to the channel so that you will be notified for all of the new free content that I will be posting. That being said, let's take a look at what we'll be covering in this free course. We will first start with the fundamentals of ASP.NET Core and the reason behind its evolution. After that, we will see what are the files and folder structures, and we will understand what are basic terminologies like pipeline, middlewares, routing, etc. in a .NET Core MVC application. Once we get our solid foundation, then we will add database to our project using Entity Framework Core. With that, we'll be able to perform CRUD operations, which stands for create, read, update, and delete. Those are the basic topics that we'll be covering in this free course. But that's not it. Once we have a functional CRUD operation website, we will be deploying that to Azure to see everything coming live with our database. So we'll be building a website and we'll be deploying it to Azure. But along with that, the most important thing is assignments and error solving. I will be giving you assignments to practice the basic CRUD operations, and you'll see common errors that we see and how to resolve those. So join me in this exciting journey of learning ASP.NET Core MVC with .NET Core 5. Before we get started, I want to show you where you can get all the project resources. If you go on .NETmastery.com and courses, I will have all of the courses listed right here. Now the free version that you'll see is a free version of the complete course ASP.NET Core MVC Up and Running Part 1. If you click on the details here, and if you click on GitHub code, you will have the complete code. We won't be building everything in this free course, but if you go on the commits here, and if you scroll down, you go to the older commits, you will see exactly on what was being changed. Like this section is included, and if you click on here, you will see what was changed in that Git commit. So if you face any issues, you can come on GitHub and you can check everything there. One place for all the resources will be .NET Mastery. If you click on details, you will be able to get all the course content and the GitHub code along with live preview of the course. So that being said, now you know how to get all of the project resources. It is through .NETmastery.com. Before we get started, let's understand on what are all the softwares that we will need for this course. The first software will be SQL Server 2019. You can also use any older version of SQL Server, that's fine with me. But if you want, you can download the latest version, scroll down here, and you can install the developer version since it is the free edition. Once you have SQL Server, then we need Visual Studio 2019. Now the .NET Core version that we are using is .NET 5, and that is available in preview right now since it has not been released yet. So for that you will need Visual Studio 2019 preview. You can come here and download the community version and install it. Along with that, you will also have to install .NET Core 5. So you can install this, and right now the preview version is Preview 5. But the course that we will be building was built using Preview 4. because of which in the course you will see I installed packages and everything for Preview 4. But what you need to do is when you create the project, whatever preview version you use, make sure to use that same preview version throughout the course in all the packages or the installation that we do. Once the .NET Core 5 is released, I will update this and let you know to install .NET Core 5 and not to work with the preview version. That being said, if you do not want to work on the preview versions and you would rather work on Visual Studio 2019, you can follow along with the course as well. For that, you'll install Visual Studio 2019 and .NET Core 3.1. The course will be compatible with that as well. So that's all the tools and technology that you will need. Install them if you do not have them and join me from the next video. In this video, I want to walk you through the journey of .NET Core. .NET Core is probably the biggest change that .NET language has encountered. In 2002, Microsoft introduced web forms, which was a revolution at that time. But as the time progressed, there was need to organize things, and with other drawbacks in picture came a new architecture, which was ASP.NET MVC. Now, even though I love MVC, it had its flaws, like it was created on top of the components for web forms. Because of that, it was tied to IIS and Windows. But as the web evolved, Microsoft had to keep up with the change. With that, finally in June of 2016, Microsoft released ASP.NET Core, and it was the first version. Now ASP.NET Core is built on top of the new .NET Core framework. It is cross-platform version and hence it is not tied with Windows. Also, .NET Core was built with cloud in mind, so it is extremely robust with that. Then, in August of 2018, Microsoft released .NET Core 2.0 and Microsoft team has been very active with releasing the new version. As you can see, in September of 2019, .NET Core 3 was released. In the intermediate versions, there was .NET Core 2.1 and 2.2. There was quite a big change coming from 2.1 to 2.2 with respects to identity, but with all the versions, upgrading to the new version has not been that difficult. Then in December of 2019, .NET Core 3.1 was released, which had a long-term support. Finally, in November of 2020, .NET 5 will be released. This .NET Core 5 is right now in the preview version and we'll be using that to create our project. So that is just a small journey for the .NET Core frameworks that have been encountered. That being said, why one should use .NET Core as compared to the classic .NET? There are quite a few advantages. First is the ASP.NET Core is fast and open source. Next benefit is it is cross-platform. The classic .NET was tied to Windows and IIS, but when ASP.NET Core was rewritten, it removed that dependency. With ASP.NET Core, we get the built-in support for dependency injection. Dependency injection saves a lot of time and it is extremely helpful. As we will proceed with the course, you will see the benefits that dependency injection brings to the picture. Then the updates to new versions for .NET Core are easy. Because of that, you can always keep up with the new versions. .NET Core is also cloud-friendly. When ASP.NET Core was rewritten, it was written in a way to make sure that they had the cloud architecture in mind. Another benefit, and one of the most important one of ASP.NET Core framework, is its higher performance. With the new enhancements as well as upgrades, the code actually gets much more optimized that results into improved performance. The ASP.NET Core compiler will eventually optimize the entire code whenever the code is recompiled using ASP.NET Core framework. ASP.NET Core's actual performance is multiple times more than any of the famous framework implementations. Because of that, it is clear that Microsoft has quite a long-term plan with this ASP.NET Core technology. So with that, let's continue learning in the next video. What we want to do first is we want to create our project. So for that, we will open up Visual Studio 2019. Right now, I am on the preview version because we do not have the .NET 5 released. So we'll be using the preview version with the .NET 5 off preview as well. So in here, we will create a new project. Then we have a list of all of the templates that are available. What we want is ASP.NET Core Web Application. You can also search for that if you cannot find it. Once we select that, we will hit the next button, and then we need to give project name, location, and a solution name. I will call this as Rocky, and I'll change the location to where I want to save it. So I'll select the location and we will hit the Create button. Once you hit the Create button, it will give you more options that you can configure for ASP.NET Core Web Application. Right here you can see the version, which is ASP.NET Core 5. Along with that, you can see right here we are on the preview version right now. Now if you'll be taking this course in the future, preview versions might be different. So make sure that you select the most latest preview version, and then in all the other places, make sure you use that exact preview version. That being said, once you have the .NET Core and ASP.NET Core 5 here, on the right hand side you can select Authentication. If you hit Change here, you have no authentication, individual user's account, work or school, or Windows authentication. Now I could go with individual user's account and get a built-in authentication. But I want to set everything up from the scratch. So we'll go with no authentication, and then later in the course we will add authentication. That being said, in the advanced we have the configure for HTTPS. We will select this. We do not want to go into Docker details right now, so I will skip this. Next, I will enable the Razor runtime compilation. Now previously, enable Razor runtime compilation was not available here, and you had to add a NuGet package for that. But now they have added this in the options. And I think this was a much needed move because Razor runtime compilation is one of the core features that you need when developing application. This enables that if you make some changes to JavaScript file, and if you save the application, go back and refresh, it automatically populates the changes rather than restarting the application. So that's enough details about that. We will make sure that this box is checked, and then the main thing here is what template that we want. Now here there are quite a few templates. We can start with an empty project, API project, web application, which is Razor Pages, or MVC Application. I will go with the MVC application, and this will give us a basic setup for an MVC application. We don't have the authentication, and once everything looks exactly like I have, let's hit the Create button. This will create our project, and it will add few files and templates to our project. Great, so our project has been added, and right here we see quite a few files. Let's continue working on this in the next video. Our project has been created, and it's time to take a look at the files and folders that we have inside our project. The first file will be the project file that we will be taking a look at. For that, if you right click on the project, you will see the option of Edit Project File. Other way of accessing that file is just double click on Rocky. That will load the project file by default. Now here in the project file, you should notice the target framework that we are using is .NET Core App 5. So this will be the .NET framework that we will be using for our solution. If you are using 3.1 or 3.0, that is the version you will see right here. Then we have few more elements, and the other important entity will be the item group. Item group will have all of the third-party packages that we will be installing in our project. Right now, when we created the project, we selected the runtime compilation on the project options, because of which it has added that NuGet package right here. When we will be adding more packages, like we'll be adding database packages, email packages, all of those will be added in the item group, and we'll be watching them once we add new packages in the upcoming videos. When you have to add the package, you do not have to come here and manually add the line. We will be doing that using NuGet packages. That being said, this looks good for our project file. Let's continue with the other files in the next video. Next important file that I want to show you is the program.cs. Now we won't be going through all the files in the same order, but I will be going through them in an order that will be easier for you to understand. The next file we'll be taking a look is the program.cs. If we scroll down here, you will see that there is a main method. Main method is more common in console application. And the reason you see that here is initially .NET Core application starts as a console application. The main method configures ASP.NET Core and starts it. The configuration is done by calling the create host builder, and as you can see, this is a method in the program class which returns an object of iHostBuilder. On this object, build and run are called, and then onwards the application will become an ASP.NET Core application. The create host builder calls default builder, which configures the web host using defaults. Also, you can see the web builder is configured using the startup file. Before we take a look at the startup file in detail, let's understand a core concept of ASP.NET Core, which is dependency injection. In this video, before we take a look at the other files, I will introduce you to a new concept, which is dependency injection. ASP.NET Core implements a simple built-in dependency injection container. Dependency injection is an integral part of ASP.NET Core architecture. .NET Core injects objects of dependency classes through constructor by using the built-in IOC container. That being said, let me try to explain in simple words what dependency injection is and what benefit it brings. Let's consider a scenario without dependency injection. So in any application, let's say we have 3 pages right now, and we have some common functionality that we want to use across all the 3 pages, like email and database access. Now let's imagine that on all of these pages, we need access to database first. So what we will do is we will create the database object on all the 3 pages, and in our case, we'll call the class name as DB. Then we'll have to do the same and create object of the email implementation that we have in all the 3 pages for the email class. Now consider a scenario. What happens if in future you change the implementation of how you access the database or email? Based on the current configuration, you might have to make changes in all the 3 pages, which is a big mess. Another issue here is on each page you have to deal with creating the object, managing them, as well as disposing them. And that would consume time in each and every page, which is a bad approach. So that being said, what is a solution to avoid all of this? The answer is dependency injection. With dependency injection, let's first see how this scenario would look like. We will again have all the 3 pages and the email and database functionality. Here, along with all the things that we had before, we will have something new, which is a dependency injection container. Then we will have the email and database functionality, but rather than having them in just classes, we will also have an interface for email and database. Then our classes will be implementing those interfaces, and we will register the interfaces in our dependency injection container, as you can see. So we will tell dependency injection container that iEmail is an interface and email is implementation of that interface. When any page will need to access these functionalities, it will just ask the dependency injection container to create object of this functionality and directly give us the object to use. So inside the page we will actually be using interfaces, and then dependency injection does all its magic of passing the object when the website needs it. That way we do not have to deal with creating the object, disposing or managing that object inside our pages. Our pages will look very clean with just the interface, and all the instance and implementation will be done by the dependency injection container. Now in future, if you want to change or replace the email class, you do not have to make any change in the pages. All you have to do is you just need to change the implementation that you do in the dependency injection container in one location. Also, as I have said before, creating and disposing object is now the responsibility of the built-in dependency injection container, and we do not have to worry about it anymore, which is a great relief. So you can see that there are lots of advantages that dependency injection brings to the architecture. That being said, with .NET Core, we have the built-in dependency injection container. Now, how do we register these dependencies, or where do we register these dependencies? Let's understand a part of that in the next video. We had to take a detour to understand dependency injection before we understand the next file, which is startup right here. You can right click here and go to the definition, or you can open up the startup file from here itself. Now startup class, as you can see, is a basic class with no extensions or implementations of interface. But the first thing that you notice if you scroll down is that there are two methods. The first one is the configure services and the next one is the configure method. Both of these methods are invoked automatically by ASP.NET Core. Configure services gets called first. We will be registering all the dependencies with dependency injection container that is built in ASP.NET Core within the configure services. So that is why I wanted to introduce you to dependency injection in the previous video, because configure services is the place where you do the registration of your service. If we switch back to the PowerPoint, the step that we do when we register our email and database with interface as well as the implementation, that is the step that we will do inside configure services method. So inside the configure services method, we can add services to the collection of services. Services are basically any functionality that you want to register so other parts of application can use it. As we saw, it could be email, database, and much more. We will be registering the services provided by the .NET Core framework as well as custom services that we will create. As of now, you can see right here we just have one services, which is add controllers with views, and with this we register MVC service to our application. We will be adding more services here, but before we dive into MVC in the next video, let's understand the configure method. But remember that configure services method gets called by the runtime, and we use this method to add services to our container. That being said, let's continue in the next video. In the last video, we took a look at configure services. Next method that we have here is the configure method. Here we see the iApplication builder as well as the iWeb host environment. Environment we are using only to check if it's development or if it's something else. Based on that, we are configuring the pipeline. But the iApplication builder configures the HTTP request pipeline of ASP.NET Core. The pipeline specifies how the application should respond to HTTP request. Let's take a look at this with an example. So in order to understand what the pipeline is, let me switch to the presentation here. We have different browsers here, and then we have a pipeline. The pipeline specifies how the application should respond to HTTP request. When your application receives a request from the browser, the request goes back and forth through the pipeline. In the pipeline, you can add items that you want. Pipeline is made up of middlewares, and MVC is a middleware itself. So if we want an application to be built using MVC, we need to add that middleware. Other examples could be authentication middleware, authorization middleware, session middleware, static files middleware, and much more. So what exactly happens is when your request will go through each middleware, it can get modified by them, and eventually it is either passed to the next middleware, and if that is the last middleware in the pipeline, the response is returned back to the server. Let's take a look at the few middlewares that are already added in our application. So if we switch back to the code, inside the configure method, first we are checking if the environment is development, then we are adding a middleware for developer exception page. Else we have the exception handler, which displays a custom error message because we do not want to show them the developer or the coding error. Then the next middleware is use HTTPS redirection. This forces the user to use a secure line, and then we are adding static files. What I mean by static files is that any web project needs styling, JavaScript, images, and much more. So all of the static content will be served by our application only because we added the middleware to use the static files. Then we are adding the routing middleware followed by authorization middleware. You can see authorization is added before the endpoints right here. And that is because order matters when it comes to the middleware. When a request comes in, it is passed from the first middleware to the second to the third and so on. In endpoint, we configure the default route for our application. That being said, before we understand the endpoints in more detail, let me explain you routing in the next video. Inside the configure method, we have seen the use routing as well as use endpoints. That being said, we haven't seen the actual MVC routing and how that works. Endpoint routing has been introduced in ASP.NET Core 3. In the initial version of ASP.NET Core, routing was a part of MVC, but it has been separated out to make routing available to all the middlewares and not just MVC. Whenever a request comes in, it hits an endpoint, and that endpoint is processed by the middleware. Before we get into those details, let me switch to presentation and I can give you an example of routing. The URL pattern for routing is considered after the domain name. So in this case, it will be after localhost and the port number, which is 5555. Then in the example URL that we have, we see category/index/3. In an MVC application, the first thing that you will see will be the name of the controller. After that, we will have the name of the action followed by the ID. Also keep in mind that ID is an optional field. Some of these fields can be optional, and if they are not present, it will take the default value. Like if an action name is missing, it will default the action name to be index. You can change the defaults if you want, but if we switch back to our application and if we see the endpoint that we are using, we have a default pattern in which we have the controller name defaulted to home, action name defaulted to index, and we have an ID property which is optional. So with that in place, let's try to see some more examples here. The first example, we have /category/index. So in that case, category will be the controller, index will be the action. We do not have anything for the ID, so ID will be null. Next, what we have is only category. In that case, the controller will be category controller and action will be defaulted to index action. And if no ID is present, it will be null. Then we have category /edit/3. We have all the fields here. Controller will be category, edit will be the action, and ID will be 3. In the last example, we have product /details/3. Again, we have all the 3 entities. Controller will be the product, action will be details, and ID will be 3. Now in MVC, there is a route table which tries to match endpoints to find out where to pass the request. To be on track here, if we have a URL like this in MVC, home would point to a controller and index would point to an action method, as we saw in the last slide. Now if you are not aware about what is a controller, what is an action method, do not worry right now. Just understand that this is one way of routing. We will be getting into MVC details very shortly. But ASP.NET Core is now more than just an MVC application. It can also have Razor pages and SignalR. That being said, it is possible to have all 3 in a single application. All of these technologies have middlewares that register endpoints. So if we switch back to our application, right here we see a middleware of use routing in startup.cs. So let's imagine at some point we hit this middleware. At this point, the request will inspect all of the registered endpoints. They can be endpoints registered by MVC or any other technology. It determines whether it should send the request to MVC or any other technology. Then for all the middlewares that will be executed after this, we'll know that endpoint has been selected like MVC or Razor pages. And then later on, when it hits the endpoint in the use endpoints, we will register the endpoint, and then when the request arrives at this point, it will be processed by the endpoint that was selected in use routing. So in the expression, we have the endpoints and we have an object for the options. On this object, there are several extension methods that are available to register different endpoints. Like right here, we are registering the MVC. Then we have other endpoints for Razor and SignalR as well. We will be adding Razor endpoint later in the course. And within the controller, which is the MVC, we have added a default pattern. So by default, it will load the home controller and index action if nothing has been loaded. So here we also have registered a default route for MVC application, which has a controller name home and an action method called as index. This map controller route uses routing table to match against the request. This is the basic overview of routing middleware that we have. That being said, before I actually run the application and walk you through routing in demo, let me finish the overview of the other files and then we'll get back to routing and view it live in action. In this video, I want to introduce you to AppSettings.json. This is the file in which we'll be adding all of the connection strings and static files like secrets that we want. In a production application, you can move this to vaults or secrets, but we'll be using AppSettings for this course. Here, right now, we see the logging, and in that we have some things that have been configured. We will be adding connection strings along with other things in this course inside the app settings. Whenever there are any keys or anything that we want to use throughout the course, it is a great place to store them right here. That being said, we'll come back to this file and we'll be adding new things in the upcoming videos. Next, what we want to see here is we have a folder called wwwRoot. This folder has been created since we selected the MVC application. In here, if you expand this, there are more folders that has static files for our application. Static files could be CSS, JavaScript, or any of the third-party libraries. You can also have images here or HTML templates. If you remember in startup.cs, if we go there, we added a middleware use static files, and that was added so that the application can use the static files that we add inside wwwRoot. This wwwRoot folder will be the root folder in application for all static files. None of the C# files will be placed in this folder. This folder is only meant to serve all the static files for our application. So we'll be using the static files folder extensively throughout the course when we have to add images, or we want to add any class libraries, or we want to modify external CSS. Once we have that, the last thing that we have is launchSettings.json. LaunchSettings.json is inside the properties folder, and if we double click, it displays different profile in which we can run the application. Like here, if the profile is IIS Express, it sets the environment variable for that profile to be development. This way you can configure more profiles that you want with the URL, SSL port, and other functionalities. Also, when we will run the application right here, we will be seeing all the profiles that we have set up inside the launch settings. So right here you can see IIS Express, and we have the Rocky profile. If you want to modify them, you can modify here directly, or you can also do the same if you right click here, and here if you go to the properties, we will be having those profiles in the debug tab. So right here you see IIS Express as well as Rocky. We can set the browser URL, and we can set the environment variables that we want. Here we have the other settings which you can set from that page, or we can do in the launchSettings.json. Now we won't be tweaking this much because this is more related to deployment, and if you want to add more environment variable for like staging another environment, but we'll just keep it with the basic for this course. So with that, we have covered all of the files that we see in the project except three main folders, which is controllers, models, and views. And as you would have guessed, this is what MVC stands for, which is model, view, and controller. That being said, let's understand the architecture of an MVC application. The first thing in MVC is the model. Model represents the shape of the data. A class in C# is used to describe a model. The model component corresponds to all the data-related logic that user works with. This can represent either the data that is being transferred between view and controller, or any business logic-related data. Model would also represent all the tables of the database. So if you have 10 tables in the database, you will have at least 10 models. On top of that, there is also more complexity, but we will go into those details later on in the course. So if a class is a model, then all the properties in that class will be all the columns of a table. So that is the simple relation that you can think about model right now. Then we have the view. View in an MVC is a user interface. View basically means whatever you see when you click a web page, the UI that you see, that will be represented by the view. View in ASP.NET MVC is HTML, CSS, and some special syntax, which is Razor syntax. So main thing about view is that it represents the user interface logic of your application. Finally, we have the controller. The controller handles the user request. Typically, whenever a request comes in, like user clicks anything, it will raise an HTTP request, which will be handled by the controller. The controller then uses the model as well as view to process the request, and then it returns back an appropriate response. So controller acts as an interface between model and view to process all the business logic, incoming requests, and it manipulates the data using model and interact with the view to render the final output. This is just a brief overview of how model, view, and controller interacts. So just to summarize, what happens is first a user clicks something on the website. So a request comes to controller. Controller will always be the main entry point in an MVC application. And in controller, it will hit any of the action methods that we have defined inside the controller. Now controller will uses the model and it will fetch all the data that it needs to display in a view. Then it passes that data to the view so that view can render the final page that user can see. Then view will send the request back to the controller, and then based on whatever is rendered, a response will be sent back and user will be able to see the page. So you can see controller can be treated as heart of your application. With that in place, in the next video, let's run our application for the first time and see how model, view, and controller interacts and how routing works. Now before I run the application and show you routing in detail, let's take a look at the folders that we have with model, views, and controllers. So right here we have a home controller, and in the model we have the error view model. Whenever we'll be adding new models, or if we want to add a new table in the database, we will be adding models inside this folder. Controller, as we know, is the heart of the application. In controller, if you expand this, you see there are many of the functions. These are known as individual action method. So a controller has action method. If we go back to the routing template that we had the controller name and the action name. So what means is if someone calls index, then they can call it home /index and the control will hit this breakpoint when the URL is submitted. And once the control gets here, we are just returning back the view. So this view will be inside the views folder and inside the home folder. The folder name will match exactly as the controller name. So it will look for an index view inside the home folder inside views. And that will correspond to the action method that we see right here. So what we have in the index view is if you open it, we have a title, we have welcome here, and then we have learned about building web apps with ASP.NET Core. Let's run this and make sure that this is actually working. So let's run our application for the first time, and great, we see that page is loaded. Now right here in the URL, we do not see any controller or action name. And the reason is if we go back to the application in startup, we configured the default to home controller index action. So that being said, if you add a debugging point right here, and if you go back and press enter, you will see that it hits this breakpoint. So it is actually calling the index action method inside your home controller. That being said, let's continue here, and the view is loaded. Now what will happen when we click privacy? You can see in the URL on the bottom here, it is going to home controller and privacy action method. So right here inside home controller, we have the privacy action method, which just returns back a view. That view will again be inside views, home, and we have the privacy view. And this is what we should see when we click that. Let's go back and click here. Now you can see the control is getting to the privacy action method, and if you hit continue, the privacy view will be loaded. Great, so we can see how routing is working so far. Right now we do not have any ID. Even if you add an ID, it will still load the privacy because ID is optional. So if you have it or if you do not, that doesn't matter. So with this, routing is making a little bit more sense on how the controllers and view routing works. One thing you should always remember is if your name is home controller, you should have a folder within the view with the name home, and in there you will add all the views corresponding to the action methods inside the home controller. That being said, right here, there are few more views that I want to explain you. Let me do that in the next video. In the last video, we saw the routing and we saw how the model and views are integrated together. That being said, in the views, we have a shared folder. This shared folder is used for partial views. Partial views are similar to user components if you are coming from classic C#. So it is basically a view that you want to consume in multiple places in your application. Along with that, we have a special partial view which is _layout. _layout is the default master page for your application. So in here, if we scroll back to the project that we are running, we have the header here. So the header and footer are included in _layout. Right here we have the header, then we have render body, and we have the footer. Along with that, in _layout, we have some styling and JavaScript that can be used throughout the application. So in future, if you want a styling or a JavaScript functionality that you want to use throughout the application, this is the place where you will add it. Other than _layout, we have a partial view which is validation scripts partial. This partial view just has the reference to some of the jQuery for validation. We will be using this in the future videos. Then we have a error.cshtml, and this is just a common error view that we have in developer mode. So that's about the shared folder views. We will be adding more partial views in future. That being said, inside the views folder, we also have two important files. First is the view imports. The purpose of view imports.cshtml file is to provide a mechanism to make directives available to Razor page globally so that you don't have to add them to the pages individually. So right here it is adding the tag helpers. So with this, all the default tag helpers that ASP.NET Core team provides will be added to all of the Razor pages in your application. If you do not have this, then you won't be able to use tag helpers in your project. An example of tag helpers can be seen in _layout. If we expand the header, right here you see these tag helpers: ASP area, ASP controller, ASP action. These are all the tag helpers that make the binding look like HTML language, but it does the binding with your C# code. Tag helpers is an idea that Microsoft team has adopted from other languages after looking at the success like Angular and React. So if in future, if you add more custom tag helpers, you can register them here and they will be available for use throughout the application. That being said, we'll go to the next file, which is view start. The main purpose of view start is to set values that all the other views will have to use. If this view exists and it is under the views folder, it enables us to set the property that applies to all the views in the system right here. A most common _layout view will set some properties. The default one in MVC is the layout page. However, you can also do complex thing in view start. For example, you can say that for a specific controller, you want to change the layout page. You can add if condition, check the controller name, and do complex logic. But we'll just leave it simple for now. So here we are defining the default master page for the application is _layout right here. So if you change this, your master page could be changed using the layout property in view start. Also, what you can do is you can add a view start inside the folder as well, and then that file will take precedence. So with that, I believe we have covered all the files that we have when the project was created. Now this has been a lengthy section and it was mostly theoretical with very little exposure to routing and the project. But this won't be the same moving forward. Moving forward, everything will be hands-on and we will be coding everything and exploring ASP.NET Core in detail. So that being said, let's get started with everything from the next video. Now that our project is created and we have an overview of all of the files that comes by default, let's add our model. Now, what is a model? Model will represent a table that we want in our database. So for our application, we want to add a table in our database for category. In there, we will have 3 columns. We'll have category ID, category name, and display order. As I told you before, we will not be touching the database directly. If we have to make any change to our database or even create the database, we will be doing that from our code. So for that, what we will do is first inside the models folder here, we will right click and we will add a new class file and we will call this as category. Inside category, what are all the columns that we want? All of those columns will be properties of this class. So we can use the snippet prop and press tab twice. Then we have a property that is generated. First, we want the ID, which will be category ID, or I can call this as an ID. In SQL Server for columns, you can have them as identity. An identity column will mean that you do not have to pass those values. Whenever you add a new record, it automatically increments by 1 and creates that. But you only have ID here. How do you tell the database or entity framework core that this column needs to be a primary key and it needs to be identity? For that, we have data annotations. You can see right here, it is inside system.componentModel.dataAnnotations. If you press enter here, it automatically adds that namespace right here. Once you add data annotations, it tells entity framework that this column needs to be an identity column and a primary key for our table. Entity framework also has default. So if the name is ID or if the name is category followed by ID, then it automatically adds it as a key entity. So even if you do not add this, it will be added by default. But I always like to be explicit about it so that when someone sees our model, they can get a better idea using this. There are many more data annotations, but we won't go into those details right now. I want to start from all the basic and then we'll go into the advanced concept. Next, what property we want, we'll press prop again and tab twice. Next, we want a string and we will call this category name. You can call this category name or I'll just go with the name. Last property that we want is an integer and let me call this display order. Now we won't be using this, but I'm just adding a new property so I can show that to you guys. So now what we have is we want to create a category table in the database and we want these 3 columns in that table. But how do we do all that? Let's take a look at that in the upcoming videos. Now we have created our first model, which is the category model. We need to push this model to our database. But first, we do not even have a database for our project. So let's go to SQL Server Management Studio and right here, let's connect to a server. Now here, one thing that you should remember is the server name. I have dot right now, but I can also change it to localDB MS SQL localDB. Now for some, this might be the server name they're able to connect to, and for others, it might be a dot. I have both of the options, so I can connect to a dot as well as I can connect to the localDB MS SQL localDB. Great, you can see both of these options work for me. Once you have that, determine which of the server you want to use. For our course, we will be using the dot. So if you expand the databases, we have 2 databases, you can expand this, you can take a look, but what we want is we want to add our own database right here. So how do we do that? For that, we need to add a connection string in our Rocky project. So right here, whenever we have to add a connection string, we'll be going to AppSettings.json. This is the file where we will be adding all of the secrets or connection strings for our project. Now once you move this to production, you can move this to appsecret.json, but for the course, appsettings.json is a perfect location. Now the next question is, where do you define connection string in here? For that, right here, we need to create a connection strings and we can assign it inside the parentheses. Now in here, we need to give a name. So I will call this default connection. And then within the double quotation, we will write the connection string. So right now we have server equal to, and I will use a dot here because that is what we are using. Next thing that we have is the database name. So we'll say database, and what name do we want? I'll call this as Rocky. After that, we will set the trusted connection to true. It will be trusted_connection is equal to true. And then we will have the multiple active result sets to be true. That's all we need for connection string. Now what I'll do is I'll copy and paste this one more time. I'll comment this out, and instead of dot here, I will paste local db MSQL local db, because this might be connection string you want to use if you wanted the different server. We'll go with the dot. Now we have our connection string in place. The next step will be using this connection string to actually create the database. Let's take a look at that in the next video. Now we need to create our database, and we also have to push the category model to the database. In order to do that, we need a DbContext in our project. DbContext is provided by Entity Framework. Before we do that, right here, let me add a new folder. And I'll call this as data. In here, we will right click, add a new class file, and I will call this application DbContext, or you can call this any other name followed by a DbContext. Now this is just a basic class. How do you make this class a DbContext? In order to do that, this class will have to implement or inherit from the DbContext. Right now, that class does not exist. If you do control dot here, it will show you options to install packages. So we need to include Entity Framework core in our project now. There are multiple ways to do that. First thing, you can directly go here and you can click find and install the latest version. Next way, you can go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and you can install the package if you know the name with the Package Manager console. And if you don't know the exact name, we will go to Manage NuGet Packages for the solution. In here, what we will do is we will go to Browse tab and we will search for our package, which is Entity Framework Core. Once you hit enter here, the first package you see is Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. Now Entity Framework Core will not be the only package that we will need. We will also need the package for SQL Server, because Entity Framework Core needs a database to work with. So that will be SQL Server. So right here, if we search for SQL Server, we will have a package Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. So in order to install this package, we'll click the project name and we will hit the install button. Now if you are on the preview versions, make sure that when you created the project, the version name for preview should match exactly like you created the project. If you created the project with preview 3, right here it should be the preview 3 that you should be installing and not preview 4. That being said, we'll switch to what we have. Once you make sure all of that is good, let's hit the install button. It asks us for the license, we'll accept this. And great, package has been installed. We see the error with DbContext, but we will solve that later on. Now if you go to Dependencies, Packages, you see you have Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.SQL Server. If you expand that, you have Microsoft Packages, and if you expand further, you see that Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore is already installed. The reason is because the SQL Server is dependent on Entity Framework Core. That's why if you install only SQL Server, Entity Framework Core gets installed by default. Now that the package has been installed, if we close this, and if we go to our application DbContext right here, you click there and you will hit Ctrl dot for IntelliSense. It says that you can now add using statement for Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. So with that, we have added Entity Framework Core in our project. That being said, we need to add some configuration here. We need to create a constructor, so we can type CTOR. You can see it is a code snippet for constructor, and we'll press tab twice. In here, since we are implementing the DbContext, we need to pass the DbContext options here, and we need to configure the application DbContext class. We'll call this as options. What we have to do is we need to pass all of these options to the base class for DbContext. Now this will include connection string as well. So we'll pass base and we'll use the options. If you do not understand this, do not worry. It's just some configuration that you have to do in order to use the DbContext. That's everything that we had to do to create a DbContext for our project. Right now, things might not be making complete sense to you, but just stick with me for a few more videos and you'll see how easy and magical this is. Now the thing that is remaining is we need to create our category table in the database, and we also have to create our database. Let's continue in the next video to finish the last step of our configuration. Now we have the application DbContext class. Next, what we want to do is we want to create the category table to our database. Whenever you have to do that, you will come to the application DbContext once you have created the model, and here we will create properties to push them to database. So we'll do prop, and this time the property type will be dbSet. In here, what is the class name, which is the entity. So the entity that we want to create to the database is category entity. And what name do you want to give to that table inside the database? I want to call it the same name as category. Now by default, the convention is to name it plural like categories. But I like to name them same as the table name or the model in our project. So that way, we will be creating a table with the category name in the database. This is all looking good and fancy, but how will this come together? For that, we will be using our startup class file because we want to configure this DbContext to be used by our application when it starts. And that configuration will always be done in startup class file. So inside the startup class file where we have the services, we will be adding a service for our DbContext. So here we have add DbContext, and in here you need to pass the entity name, which is application DbContext. Then we need to configure options on that property, and if you see right here, we are passing those options to DbContext. So in startup, what are the options we want to configure? First thing is we want we want to use SQL Server. So right here, you will have to add the namespace Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore, and then you need to configure the SQL Server options. Now SQL Server options does not need many things. It just needs a connection string. And that connection string is inside AppSettings.json inside connection strings. Make sure that you name this exactly and there is no spelling mistake, or else this won't work. Once you make sure both of them are looking exactly like me, you'll come back to startup and we have the configuration object here. On configuration object, we have an extension method getConnectionString. What this will do is it will look into your app settings and it will go inside connection strings right here. In there, what key should it search for? Key will be the default connection. So we will copy this, come back here, and inside double quotes, we will paste default connection. That way it will retrieve the connection string and it will pass it to the options for SQL Server. So that's all configuration we had to do to add our DbContext and use of SQL Server to our project. So with that, we complete the configuration that was needed. But right now, the SQL Server does not have our database or the table. For that, we need to understand migrations. Whenever we will have to push any change from our website to our database, we will be creating migrations. Let's understand them in the next video. Now we have added in our DbContext the category model. So the next thing that we have to do is we need to add a migration to push that to the database. In order to add migration, we'll go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and we will open up Package Manager console. In here, we will be adding our migration. So for that, we will add a command, add migration, and then we will give our migration a meaningful name. What are we doing in the first migration? We are adding the category table to database. So we can say add category to database and we will hit enter. When you do that, you will see an error message. It says the term add migration is not recognized as a name of commandlet function, script file, or operable program. If you created your project with individual user's account identity, then you won't see this error because it installs the NuGet package that is needed for migration. But since we did not do that, we will have to install another NuGet package. So we'll go to the NuGet Package Manager and we will search for tools. We want to install Microsoft.EntityFramework.Tools. Right here, this is Entity Framework Core Tools for NuGet Package Manager console in Visual Studio. Make sure you install the correct version. And great, everything looks good. So we will close this. And if we go back to our application DbContext, let me open the Package Manager console here. Let's try to run this one more time. In order to run the same statement, you just press the up arrow. The build started, build succeeded, and it added our migration. Now this is Entity Framework code doing its magic. You can see what it's doing is it is creating a table called as category, and it has 3 columns. First is the ID column, which is of type identity, and nullable is false. Then we have the name and display order, and it also adds a constraint to make the x.id as the primary key. So all of this magic is done by Entity Framework Core. It automatically converts your model that you have into migrations, and then you can push these migrations to the database. So how do you push them to database now? For that, if you go to Package Manager console, here let me clear this out, and the next command is update database. So once you have that command, and if you press enter, it will push all the pending migrations to the database. In case like ours where the database does not exist, it will first create the database and then proceed further. Now if you have any errors while building the project, you won't be able to get past this step because your project must build successfully in order to proceed. So right here you can see it's done. What exactly just happened? Let's understand that in the next video. Now that we have pushed the migration, let's see what actually happened in SQL Server. In here, we see the new database, which is Rocky. Let's expand that. And we have the tables. Now in tables, you see we have created category table, but Entity Framework Core already added _EF migrations history. Here it keeps a track of which migrations are actually applied so that it can synchronize everything. Right now there will be just the name of the first migration that we added, which is add category to database. So we'll close this and then let's examine the category table. It has the 3 columns that we wanted. So it actually pushed our category model to the database and everything is looking good right now. So remember, whenever you have to make changes, you first make the changes, add a migration, and then you update database to push the migration to the database. So that being said, let's continue in the next video. Before we start with anything, let's run the application. So if we go in the arrow here with the browser, you can pick which browser you want for the application. I will be using the new Microsoft Edge. And let me run this and take a look at the result. So our application is up and running and we see home and privacy. What we want to do is we want to add a new tab here, or we can replace the privacy tab with category. How do we do that? This navigation bar that we have is inside the shared folder inside views. So if we go to views, shared, we have the underscore layout, and right here we have the home and privacy. Here you can see the action name is privacy and the controller name is home. What we will be doing is for category, we will be adding a new controller. So for that, we'll go to Solution Explorer in Controllers. We'll add a new controller. In order to do that, we will have to stop the application and Controllers, add a new controller, and we will go with the empty controller. Now what you need to do is we need to name our controller. It should always end with the controller keyword. So whatever is before that will be the controller name, and we will call this category controller. Great, so you can see our new controller has been created, and in there we have an index action method. How can we navigate to this controller using our URL? Let's run the application. And then if we want to go to the privacy action in home controller, you can see the URL is home followed by privacy. So in order to go to our category, it will be category controller, and what is the action name? That is the index action name. But if you press enter right now, you will see an error that view index was not found. That is because we have added the action here, but we have not added the view. So inside layout, what we will do is change this to category controller, action, we'll change this to index, and we will call this category. If you go back and if you refresh the home page, let's go here. This time the privacy will be updated to category. But if you click on category, you will still see that error message. Let's continue in the next video to fix this error message and add our view. Now if we try to navigate to category controller index action, the view is not found. So let's add that view. For that, it is simple. You can do one of the two things. First is inside views, you can create a new folder with the exact name as the controller name, which is category. It won't be category controller, it will be only category. And then in there, you can right click, add a new view here, and that will do the trick. Or simple way, go to category controller, right click on the action method, select add view. We will be using the razor view. Do not go with the empty option here. And then you can see here we have some configuration. First is the view name, which will keep the same as index. Next, you can use template when you create a view. It can be create template, edit, details, or delete. We will be going with the empty template, and we don't want any model classes right now. If you select any of the other, then you have to select the model class. Like if you want to create, what object should it create? Should it create a new category? If yes, what should be the DbContext that should be used? But if you go with empty, you don't get those options. That being said, we have not used partial views right now, so we'll leave this unchecked. And the option here is use a layout page. If you check this and if you leave this empty, it will use the default layout that you have. So we'll just keep that and press the add button. It will add few NuGet packages for scaffolding, and then it will create the index view. One thing to notice is the view will be added inside a folder name with the exact name as your controller, which is category. That being said, if you run the application now, and if you hit the category, you will see the page with the word index in there. So if you hit category, great, you can see the view is being rendered. So now that our view is added and our database is in place, let's see how we can create a category. Let's continue working on the index page in the next video. What do we want to do on the index page of category? We want to display all of the categories that exist in our database. Right now, we do not have any categories in our database. But let's say we add some categories manually for our testing. So we can go to database, edit top 200 rows, and we'll just give it a test name, display order 1. We'll give it test 2, display order 2. We have 2 categories now. So if you do select star here, you will see 2 records. Let's see how we can display them here. In order to display them, we need to extract these values from the database. So for that, we'll be using Entity Framework. And we need the application DbContext or the DbContext to do that. So we'll go to the category controller, and in here, we need an object of application DbContext. But thankfully, Dependency Injection takes care of all of that. So right here, we'll just use application DbContext and we'll get that using Dependency Injection. So right here, we will be adding a private read-only property, and this will be for application DbContext. We'll call this _db. Now we need to populate this property, and we'll do that with constructor, and we'll be using Dependency Injection. If you go to your startup CS, right here, you have added the DbContext. So you have already added that in your service container. If you want to pull something from that container in the constructor, you just write the class or the interface name. So this one is application DbContext, and we'll call this DB. What this object will have is it will have an instance of the DbContext that Dependency Injection would create and pass it to you in your constructor. You do not have to worry about all the backend behind that. ASP.NET Core takes care of everything. So you can just assign your local _db as the DB object that is passed, and then you can use this _db throughout your controller. So we have the database object in _db. What if we want to retrieve list of all of the category? So in the index, let's retrieve an IEnumerable of category, and let me call this object list, obj list is equal to. How do we retrieve that from database? We will be using Entity Framework, so we have the database object, and in there you already see category. If you just do like that, it will retrieve all of the categories from your database, and it will store them in this obj list. Let me copy, paste it to the view, and we'll return that list to be displayed in our view. Let's add a debugger and see if it actually passes anything. Let's run the application. and let's hit category. It will hit our debugging breakpoint, and right now the list should be empty here. That's good. If we press F10 to continue to the next line, if you hover, now you see the list and result view. It should have two values. And these are the two categories that we added. So you can see how easy it was. We did not have to write a query like select star from category. Entity Framework core takes care of everything. Just one line and you get all of the categories. So even though we spent some time in configuration for Entity Framework and dbSet and dbContext, you can see the advantage that it brings to the table. And in future, this will save tremendous amount of time, as we will see. So now we have list of all the categories and we are passing that to the view. If you hit continue here, you will see that we do not see any of the list. That's because if we go to the index view, we are not fetching that model or we are displaying anything in here other than index. Let's do that in the next video. Now we want to display all of the categories in our view. So we are already passing that from our controller when we return to the view. Whenever you pass anything from the controller, you need to make sure that you fetch it inside your view. Now how do you tell this view that actually a list of categories is going to be passed to you from the controller? For that we will define addModel on the top here. In here, M will be of lowercase. And then we will define what will be the model type. Here it's an enumerable of category. So we'll say it's an IEnumerable of category. If you type just category, this works. But what I prefer is I prefer rocky.models.category. This way you know the complete path for the category. So in large scale application, you are not confused. Now what will happen is the list that we will pass from here will be available on this view and we can display that. So we can use some bootstrap styling and we can display a table. We can add a div, give it a class of container, and we'll give padding 3 in here. Then we can add a div, give it a class of row, and padding top, we'll give it 4. And in there we'll add a div, give it class of column 6. We'll divide it in 2 paths. We'll have another div, class of column 6. In the first one here, we will have an h2 tag, and we'll give it a class of text primary. And we'll call this as category list. In here, we want to display a link to create new category. That looks good. Then let me add some line here, and then I'll display a table. Now the table I only want to display if there are more than one categories that have to be displayed. So with Razor syntax, you can combine C# syntax with the HTML. For that, you just write the @ sign, and then here we have the for loop, we have for each loop, you can see, and we also have if conditions. So we can use the C# if condition, and we want to see if this has more than one category. Here the model was lowercase, but whenever anywhere else in the view, if you want to access this model, it will be a capital M. So it will be model dot, we just want the count on that. If it is greater than 0, that means that category exists. So if the category exists, we want to display a table, and we can use bootstrap classes for table, table bordered, and table striped. We can also give it a style of width of 100%. Inside here we have the T head, and we have the table row in which we'll have the header. First one, let me display category name, followed by display order, and we'll have an empty th. So this looks good for the heading. Then we have the T body. In body, let's say you have 10 category. So you want a loop that is iterated 10 times and you display all of the properties. So like we had the if with the razor, we also have for each, and we'll iterate through all the categories. So we'll say variable object in model. Now what is model? Model is actually the IEnumerable or list of category. So right here, we will add a tr tag and we'll display td. We'll give it a width of 50%. The first thing here is the category name. So at obj dot, we have the name in there. We'll copy this, paste it one more time. We'll give it 30% and we can display the display order. And then in the last one here, td, let's say we want to display the buttons to edit or delete a category, but we'll do that one thing at a time. Then we have the if condition, so we can add an else block and we can just display in paragraph no category exists. So this looks good. Let's run our application and see how things look like. We'll go to category and we'll continue on our debugger. Great, we see both of the categories here. We have the create new category, so we'll make this a button or a link and we'll continue working on this in the next video. Now we have worked on our index page and we are loading all of the page. For that, what were the two things that were needed? One was the controller action method inside category controller, and we needed a corresponding view. What we want to do is we want to create a new page for creating a new category. So for that, the first thing that we'll do is we'll need a new action method right here. So we can copy this and paste it one more time, and this will be for create. What happens in the create? In create, we will display them two empty text box to enter the name and display order for the new category they want to create. That being said, since everything will be empty, we do not even have to pass anything to the view. It can be empty. So this, make sure that this is get for create. Once we have added the controller, let's add the view as well. It will be the razor view and we'll keep it the same. Let's add this. First thing that you do whenever you add any view is, will there be a model needed for this view? We are not passing anything from the controller, but that doesn't mean we won't be using a model in the view here. We will be using model, which will be category. So we'll go to rocky.models.category. Now, why do we need a model here? And the reason we need model here is whenever user enters any of the category name and display order and hits the create button, we want to pass those values to our action method, which will be a post action method for category, and we want to create the category. So here what we'll do is we'll add a form and it will have a method of post and where it should post. We can explicitly define that using tag helpers. Tag helpers looks exactly like HTML, but they are ASP dash, and then these are the default tag helpers that ASP team provides. So right here you can see there is a tag helper called ASP action. We will call this as create. This means that when the form executes a post method, it should look for a post action method of create. We will add that in the next video, but I wanted to point that out. In here, we'll use some bootstrap classes of border and padding 3. And in here, we'll add div, give it a class of form group and row. And we'll add the heading here, h2, give it a class of text info. And we'll give padding left of 3. We'll call this add category. Now that we have that, let's run this application and see this title. If we go to category and we'll remove this debugging point, Right now, we do not have the button to navigate to the Create New category. So let's do that in the index. Right here, we have the Create New category. How do we navigate to that page? In order to go to that page, you will have to go to the action method, which is create, inside the category controller. Thankfully, we have tag helpers for that. So right here, inside the anchor tag, we have the ASP action tag helper. What action do we want to redirect to? We want to redirect to the create action, and that is inside the controller, which is the category controller. Typically, you would write the controller name before the action name. That's how the navigation goes. First, what controller? In that controller, what is the action method? Once you have that, you'll close the anchor tag. After the create new category, let's go back and refresh here. And if you click here, it takes you to your add category. Let's add a little bit of styling here. So we'll add a class of btn primary, and let's see how this looks. Okay, we'll also align this to right. So we have text right, and perfect. So when you hit on create new category, it takes you to the add category. Let's continue working on add category in the next video. Now we want to add the text boxes for adding a new category options like name and display order. So we'll go back to our project and let's stop this. Now we will be doing that inside create. We will be adding a little bit of more bootstrap styling. I don't want to spend much time on bootstrap styling, so I will be attaching snippets with the course where you can get them and paste those bootstrap directly here. In section 1, I have lecture project resources in which I explain how you can get all the snippets. So right here we are on section 2, but if you go back, you will have all the section. So we will open up the add category snippet and we'll copy this, go back to the create, and make sure you add this after this form group and row and paste it here. You can see it's not doing anything fancy. If you save this and run the application, you will see what exactly was done. So if we go to category here and we go to create new, great, you see name, display order, and here we need text boxes, and we'll create 2 buttons. One button to go back to the previous page and one button to create or add a category. So let's switch back. Here we want to display name. So rather than using just name, we can use tag helpers. So we have a label. In there we have ASP4 tag helper, and here you will see all the properties in your model like name. You can also add a class if you want, but I'll keep it simple. What is the advantage of using this tag helper rather than typing just name? Let me also add a display order here, and we'll save this. If we go back and refresh, there you go, not much difference. The advantage that this tag helper brings is if we open up our category model, right here you can use data annotations to display something else. Like here, if you go back, display order is one word. What if you want a space in them? For that we have data annotations. So right here we have display name, and here we'll say display order. Once you do that, and if you run the application, this time it will use whatever we gave as display name because we are using the tag helper. So if you go to create new category, now you see a space between. So that way inside your model you can define what display name you want, and there are many more data annotations which we will take a look in the upcoming videos. So now you saw one advantage that you have with the tag helpers. That being said, we also have tag helpers for input as well. So in the input tag here, we will use the tag helper which is ASP4. This input is for the name, and we can give it a class of form control to take full width. Let's go back and refresh here. And great, we have a text box. Let me switch back to the application and do the same for display order. If you refresh, perfect, we have two nice looking text boxes. Let's also add buttons. So we'll go back, and here we can do an input of type submit, or you can just add a button here. Then we'll add bootstrap classes btn, btn info, and width of 100%. Let's call this create. And we need a value will be create. After that, for back button, we can add a link here, and we can copy the link that we have in index, and we'll paste it here. When we want to go back, we do not need the controller name. The action name that we want to go to is the index action to display all the categories. And here we can just display back. If you save this and refresh, great, we have create and back. And I'll make this as success and width of 100. So we have two buttons now. If you click back, it takes you back to the category. One thing you notice here is you do not need the category name. That name is optional because you are dealing with views in the same category. If you had to go to the page or view that belongs to a different controller, then you need to explicitly define the controller name here. By default, it assumes you mean the same controller that you are in right now. So with this, our page is looking in a good form when we see the add category. Let's continue in the next video. This time what we want is when we enter anything here and hit the create button, it should add a new category to database. So for that, if we go back to our application, you can see we have input type of submit, and then we have a form here which goes to the post of create. So if we go to category controller, we need to add that. We can copy the get for create, paste it here, but this time we need a post for create. Now inside the post right here, we will get a category object that we have to add to the database. With post, what you should do is you have to define that this is actually a post action method. So you'll add an attribute HTTP post, and we will be using validate anti-forgery token. Validate anti-forgery token is a built-in mechanism with the forms in which it appends an anti-forgery token, and on the post you validate that that token is still valid and the security has not been tampered. So we get that built-in security, so we'll use that in all of the post action methods. Now here you will receive the object that you have to add to the database. Adding to database is simple. You need to access the DbContext DB on category. You have the add method provided by Entity Framework Core. On there, you can see it expects a category entity. So we'll pass the object, and then at this step, it will not add the category to database. If you want to add it, you have to call save changes, and then it makes the database call on line 41. Once it adds the category, what we want to do, we can just go back to this index and display all the categories. So rather than returning back to a view, we want to return redirect to an action method. And what action method do we want to redirect to? We want to redirect to this index action. Since it is in the same controller, we do not have to define the controller name here. Let's give this a try and see how things look. Let's go back and add a debugger right here. And let's go to category, add a new category. We'll try to add this. We hit our debugging point, and inside the object here, you see we have the display order as well as name, which is valid. How did it automatically bind this and pass it here? The reason is if you go to the create, you used tag helpers for input. Since we used AS before, it automatically knew that whatever was being entered in this text box, it has to bind that to the name property of the model, which is category, and on the post it passes that to our controller right here. So if you do F10, you execute the add statement. If you go back to the database and you execute here, it has not been executed. If you run the save changes and if you go back, now you'll see 3 records. So you can see it actually executes on save changes. Let's hit continue, and now we see the 3 categories. Great, so with this you can see that how we can create a new category, and we implemented the post action method for create. Everything looks good right now, but what if we want some validations? Let's take a look at that in the next video. Before we move on to validations, let's practice what we have learned so far with an assignment. In this assignment, I want you to create an application type model. In that model, we will have 2 properties, ID and name. We created the category model with more properties, so this should be somewhat similar to that. Once you create the model, then you have to push that model to the database so that a table can be created for that model. Once you are able to successfully create the table inside the database, then you should work on creating an application type controller. So the name of the controller should be application type, and in there you have to implement the index and create functionality that we did with controllers so far. So it is exactly following the steps that we did, but for a different model. So good luck with the assignment, and this will give you practice to understand what we have been implementing so far. Now in this video, let's work on the solution for the assignment. I hope you were able to do all the 3 points that were here. Let's start with the first one, in which we have to create the model for application type and push that to the database. We'll switch back to the application, and in here we'll close everything that we have. Close all tabs. Let's go to Solution Explorer, and we have our models right here. We can copy the category model and paste it one more time here, and we'll change the name to application type. We will copy the name and we'll paste it here. Now we need properties inside the application type, which is ID and name. We do not want the display order. You can remove the key data annotation if you want, but I'll just leave it here. Once you add the model, you need to add this to database. So for that, what you have to do is you need to go to Data, Application DbContext, and we need to create a DB set for application type. We will call this application type, and we won't use the plural notation. Once you save this, you have to add the migration. So Tools, NuGet Package Manager, we'll go to the console, and here let me clear this, and we'll add a new migration. We'll call this add application type to database. Great, so migration has been added, and right here if you see, it is adding the 2 columns, ID and name, and it has a primary key on the ID column. This looks good. Let's update the database. I'll increase the size here. There we go. And perfect. Database has been updated. Let's go to SQL Server to validate them. We'll refresh here, and we have the application type. If we expand this, we have 2 columns. So perfect. Our first task from the assignment has been completed, in which we had to create the application type model, and we had to push that to the database. Next thing that we have to do is we need to create the application type controller. So let's switch back again, and we have the controllers. I can just copy the category controller and paste it one more time. I'll change the name to application type. Now I hope you did not do the copy and paste and you created from scratch. I do not want to spend time there, so I'll just make the changes. We'll change the names here. We need application DbContext. Right here, this will be of application type, and this will be application type as well. We'll retrieve the application type object and we'll add that right here. Sweet. So here it will be application type, and that looks good. Final thing that you have to do is you need to add the views as well. So what we can do is we'll just go here and we have the views, which is category. We can just copy this and paste this one more time. We'll change the name to application type. Whoops, we have a spelling mistake there. There we go. And we'll change the create. The model will be application type. In there, we do not need display order. We'll remove that. Everything else looks good. In the index, we do not need the display order, and we do not need the controller. Only the action name is sufficient, and this will be application type. Great. We'll just have the name here, and we do not need display order. Great. Now let's give this a test. We'll go to Solution Explorer. Inside Layout, we need to add another link for application type here. So we'll call this application type controller. And perfect. Let's run our application and take a look at if we are able to create any new application type. On the navbar, we have application type now. We ran into an error here, and I think that's in the application type controller. We are passing application type list. In the index, we have category. You can see the class is application type, so this will be application type as well. So you can see if the model here is different than what you pass from the controller, you will get an error message. Then we'll hit the refresh button and this should load. Perfect. We have the category list here, so we'll change that to application type list. Great. Let's create a new application. Here also we have the category. So inside create for application type, we'll change the heading to add application type and refresh. Let's try to add a new application. And great, it's working as expected. So that was the quick assignment that we did. Next thing, we'll be working again on the category. But before we work on the edit or delete functionality for category, I want to show you validations that we have to implement in category. So let's take a look at that in the next video. Now in the last video, we had some practice with application type. Let's switch back our focus to category, and in here, let's add some validation. We want a validation that name should be a required field and display order should be greater than 0. How do we actually implement those validation? Now you can always use custom JavaScript to check what was entered and display alert message. But with ASP.NET Core, you get validations right out of the box. In order to implement validations, we again have data annotations. In order to check that out, let's switch back to the application, and we did not have to rerun it. Let me stop that. What we will do is we'll open up the category model. We'll close everything else, and we'll open up the category model. Here we have attributes like key, display name. Similarly, we have requirements for validation. So on name, we just add a required attribute before that property. Then the display order will make sure that this is required as well. And with display order, we want it to be greater than 0. For that, we have range. With range, you have to define the minimum, which is 1, and what is the maximum. So we can just say int.maxValue could be the maximum. And then for the third property here, you can define an error message. Default error message, if you don't like it, you can always provide a custom error message. So here we can just display order for category must be greater than 0. Once you add this, how do you actually implement these validations inside your view? Let's take a look at that by going to our view. So for category, we have the create view. Here we have tag helpers for validation as well. What we need to do is on the top here, we first need a div and we'll use ASP validation summary. It has multiple properties, all, model only, and none. Let's keep it to model only for now, and we'll add a class of text danger to display it in red. That being said, where we have the individual properties in those places, let's add a span, and in there we have another tag helper ASP validation for. In this span, we will display if any error messages are for the name property. So in here, we'll define name here, and we'll give it a class of text danger. We will copy this and we'll do the same for display order. So let me add that here. Once you do this, and if you run the application, you won't see the change because you are not right now validating it. Now validations, you can do it on server side or on the client side. Let me show you first how to do the validations on the server side. So server side, we have the controller for category. So we'll open up the category controller, and before we actually add a category, we want to validate. We already have the validations inside the category model. So ASP.NET Core has a method here, which is model state.isValid. This actually checks if all of the rules that you have defined in your model are those valid. If those are valid, only then it will go inside the if condition. So only if it is valid, we'll paste it to add the new category and return to the index. If it is not valid, we just want to return back to the view so that we can display the error message. Now when we return back to the view, we can pass the object right here so that we can have those values. Let's see this in action. So let's run the application and let me add a debugger. Once we do that, let's continue in the next video. Now that we have added the debugger, let me switch back to the application and let's go to category. This time, if we try to create a new category and hit it with the empty record, you see it goes back and it hits our breakpoint. Here we have to debug the model state. So if we go on model state, let's first examine the isValid. You can see it's false. Now what properties are invalid? So if you hover on model state, expand this, go to result view, you see both the properties and both of the validations are invalid. So if it's invalid, you'll continue, it will return back to the view and it displays the error message. Okay, so that looks good. Let's say we add some value here and the display order will make it 0. Display order, if you remember, we have validation that it should be greater than 0. If you hit create again, the isValid is still false. This time if you examine what properties are not valid, it's only display order. The name is now valid. So you can see how validations are working. And now you see your custom error message that we implemented. So with this, we saw the server-side validation. If you change this to something valid now, and if you try to create, it should be successful. You can see it was created, and we have the same test with display order too. Now we have the server-side validations. But what if we want to do the validations on client side to avoid a round trip? Implementing those is simple as well. You will just go back to your create, and right here at the end we will add a section for scripts. Here you can add any of the JavaScript. If you take a look at the solution, inside the shared we have validation scripts partial. We need to use this inside the section here, and it will do the client-side validations automatically. So here we will use the tag helper in which we have partial. We'll give it a name of underscore validation scripts partial. Make sure that the name is exactly as you see right here. With that in place, if you save this and if you refresh the application, if you try to hit the create button, you see the error message directly here without making a round trip. If you go back, we still have our debugger in model state.isValid, but it doesn't even hit there and it displays the error message as soon as you change it. So it's not hitting our server and the validations are being done on client side now. So with this, we have seen how we can implement client side validations and server side validations. I want to show you one more thing. If you switch back to the create, in the validation summary, we have model only. If we make it all, and if we go back and refresh the page, let's try to hit the create button. Now you see two things. Where we have the validation summary, it displays all of the error message, and then in the model, it displays the corresponding. So if you have model only, in that place, it was only displaying the error message where you have the ASP validation for. So those are the two things that I wanted to show you with all and model only. So we'll save it and we'll just use model only. Even if you comment this line out and if you go back and hit create, it still acts the same. But I wanted to point out the changes, so I added the validation summary. But in future, just validation for will be sufficient, and for client side, we need to include validation scripts partial. So that being said, we have completed the validations for category. Now we need to add two more buttons here. First button will be to edit a category, and the next one will be to delete a category. So let me switch back to the application, stop it here, and we'll go to the category index right here. If we scroll down here where we have the TD that is empty, here we will be adding buttons. So we can just add a class of text center here, and we'll give a div, give it a class of W 75%, and we'll make it button group. We can also add a role of group here, and I want to add two anchor tag. We have an anchor tag on the top, so we can just copy this and paste it right here 2 times. First one here will be for edit, and the later one is for deleting a category. Now we need action names for edit and delete, so we'll call them edit as well as delete. We have not added these actions, but we will do that in a while. So we have btn primary, and for delete we'll make it danger to give it a red color. Now think about whenever we have to edit or delete a category, what is one thing that we will need? The one thing that we'll need is the category ID that user wants to delete. So how will we pass that ID when this link will be clicked? ASP.NET Core also has a tag helper for that, which is ASP_route hyphen, and then you need to pass the ID or the name that you want to give to that parameter. We will just call it ID, and here we need to pass the ID that we want to retrieve in the action method, so that we can access using this obj. So we'll pass obj dot. We should see all of the properties, and we want to pass the ID of the category here. So we'll copy this and we'll paste it in edit as well. With that in place, let's run our application and make sure the buttons are displaying. We do not have the action, so if you click, it will just give us an error message. So right here, we go to category and we have the edit and delete. I also want to add some margin here. So where we have the classes right here, I'll do margin x2. Okay. And this looks much better. So now if you hover on the edit, you can see the ID is appended in the URL. And also if you go on delete, you will see the same things. If you click, we have the URL, but we do not have that page or action method. So let's add those action methods in the next video. In this video, we want to work on category controller and we want to add the edit and delete action. Now in edit and delete both of them, we are passing the ID. So if we go to category controller, we can copy the get for create and paste it right here. We'll call it get for edit and we'll call this as edit as well. In here, we will be receiving an ID because that is what we are passing from the ASP route ID right here. So we'll receive an ID and based on that ID, we need to retrieve that category from the database and we need to display that to the user. So here we will first check if ID is equal to null. Let's make it a nullable field. Or we can say if ID is equal to 0. If it is any one of these scenarios, we will just return back not found because that is invalid. If that is not the case, we want to retrieve the category from the database. Now we will be using the DbContext. In there we have category. This will retrieve all of the categories. But we just want the one category where ID matches the ID that we receive in the parameter. So for that, EF code provides a find method in which you need to pass the ID. Here, the find method works only on primary key. So if you pass the primary key of category, it will go through that column and pick a record whose primary key matches what we pass here, which is the ID. After we get that, we can check here if object is null. This means record was not found and we can return back not found again. If it finds the record, let's pass the record to the view so that we can display it. So this looks good. Let me add the view. We'll go with the razor view and let's add this. Edit will look exactly similar to what we have for create, but the only difference is values will be populated. Let's go to the create for category, copy everything, close this and paste it right here. Rather than action, which is create, we can just remove this from form. The reason I was able to remove that is we are in edit and the post action is also the same name as edit. So in that case, it is an optional field. If it was something else, then you should define what action it should post to. Since it is same, we can remove that. We do not need the validation summary. Rather than add, we will display edit category here. We'll scroll down. In the value create, we will just display update. With that in place, let's run this application and give edit a try. So we'll go to category. We should have two buttons, edit and delete. Let's click on edit. Great, you can see the name as well as display order was populated by default. So next thing that we want to do is when we hit this update, these values should be updated in the database. Let's work on that in the next video. Now we need to implement the update functionality. So we'll close the application here and we'll go to category controller. We can copy the post action method for create and paste it for edit. We'll call this edit, and the object that it should receive should be category, and we just need to change the name here to edit. Then when we are adding a category rather than add, we should add the update here. And then we'll save the changes, redirect back, and everything looks good. Now this will work for category, but if you have complex object where within category you have other objects and everything, here you will face an error. The reason is if you go back to your edit, right here we are using name and display order, so when we'll be posting, we'll be getting those two values. But what about the ID? We have not used it anywhere here, because of which the ID will be 0. So what is recommended is right here, we'll have an input field, we'll use ASP4, which is the ID, and then we'll have it in a hidden field. That way, when we post the form, in the object, we have the ID as well. The update will only work if there is an ID associated, because based on that it finds out which entity or which category it has to update in the database. That being said, let's run this application and give that a try. So if we go to category, and if we try to edit the test with display order 1 to 555, update, great, you can see it has been updated successfully. Also in edit, if you remove this and hit update, we get the error message and everything is working as expected. Last thing that is remaining is the delete functionality. Let's take a look at that in the next video. Now what we want to work on is the delete functionality. So the delete page will look somewhat similar to edit page. The difference is these things will not be editable at all and will have a delete button. So let's go back to our application and we can copy the edit. We'll paste it for delete. In delete as well, we are getting the ID that user wants to delete. So we'll call this delete and this will be delete as well. Now with delete, we do not want the complete object. All we care about is the ID. So we are just getting the ID and that should do the trick. But when we do that, we get some other error message with the delete. The reason is we have two methods here with the same parameters. Previously we had the category object, so this was fine. How do we fix this? We can change the name to something like delete confirmed or delete post. But in the view, we want the name as delete and that will take care of this error. That being said, rather than update, we will have to use the remove method on there, but we need the object. So we can retrieve that object using this method here. We'll paste it here and we'll find it based on the ID, pass it to remove, save the changes, redirect back to action. This looks good for the delete post. And delete get will be exactly same as edit get because we need to retrieve the category and pass it to the view. Now with delete, we don't care about the model state because there won't be validation. The only check if you want to add is the object. If this is null, then we do not have anything to delete and we'll just return not found. Else we'll just remove the entity that we found and redirect back to the index action. So this looks good. Next we need to add the view. So inside category we can copy the edit and paste it one more time. We'll call this delete and the model will be same. Rather than edit category, this will be delete category. Then we want to display the name, but we do not need any validations. And we'll make them disabled so the user cannot edit them. With the button, we'll call this as delete and the class will be danger to display a red color. Perfect, so everything looks good. Let's run this and give this a try. Once we know the basic foundations of one CRUD operations, now you will see the pattern and everything will start to make much more sense. When we go to category, Let's try to delete. As soon as you try to hit the delete button, nothing happens. What is the reason? The reason is simple. Right here, if we go to the controller, the name is delete post. So what you can do is we'll copy this and we can go to the delete.cshtml. In the form method, we can write the ASP action and we can say delete post since it is not the same name as delete. You do that, you refresh the application and you hit the delete button. It works now. So you can see one workaround when the action name is not same, you can explicitly specify what action should be called on the post action method for this form. So with this, we have completed the CRUD operations on category. Now that we have completed the CRUD operations on category, I want to add Font Awesome in my website. So we'll go to Font Awesome here. Here we have the Font Awesome. Let's go there and let's hit on the start and we'll get started. Here we'll hit the download and the download begins. Once it finishes, we'll open this up and extract it. So I'll extract this and we'll close it here. We'll go to our snippets folder because that is where I extracted, and we have the Font Awesome right here. What I will do is I will copy everything that we have here and we'll switch back to our solution. We'll right click on wwwRoot folder and open in Folder Explorer. Here what I will do is I'll add a new folder for Font Awesome and I'll paste everything that we copied. Great, so we have copied everything here. How do we use Font Awesome now? Using that is simple. We'll just go back and we have to add that in underscore layout. We have the CSS here. We'll add a link rel of style sheet and we'll add an href of, we'll point to the CSS. Here the IntelliSense is not working. Let me stop the application and we will add that path. So right here inside wwwRoot we have Font Awesome, CSS and all.css. Let me pin this. With that in place, Font Awesome is added to our website. Now how do we use the icons? Let's run the application and see we don't see any error message. And next thing, we'll start using the icons. We'll go to category and let me add a plus sign right here with the create new category. So we'll go to the index and let me go to Font Awesome again. And we'll search for plus sign. You go here and you'll copy this. We'll go back in the index where we have create, we'll paste it and we'll add a space. We'll save that, go back and refresh, not this, there we go. This should add a plus sign right here. Great, you can see Font Awesome is working. Let me add icons for edit and delete. So if we go here and if we search for edit, we have the first icon. I'll just use that, copy it, go back to the application, we'll paste it here, and then we'll do the delete icon, copy this, and just paste it right here. Next, I want to go back. I'll just use the sign out icon for that. We'll copy this and we'll go back to edit. We have the back right here. We'll paste it. I'll do the same in delete as well. And we have the create. So let me go to the views. We have the create and we'll scroll down. Let's go back to the application and see if everything now looks good. Great, we have edit and delete. And then if we go on create new, we have the back icon And perfect. Everything looks good. Now here, rather than displaying edit, delete and everything, I'll just have the icon and I'll remove the text. This is self-explanatory, so we'll leave it at that. So with this, we have completed adding font awesome to our project, and all the CRUD operations with the category is working. Next, it's time to replicate the pending things that we have for application type in the next assignment. Things are moving along great and we are making good progress. Next thing for our assignment is we need to add the required validation for the application type name, and we want to do that on both client side and server side. Along with that, we need to perform edit and delete functionality with application type. This is exactly what we did with category, so you should not face any issue. So good luck with the assignment, and in the next video, I'll do the same to provide the solution. So we need to do two functionalities. First, we need to add the validation. So let me switch back. And we need to work with application type model. So right here, we need to add the required, and that will take care of making it a required property. Once you make this change, then we need to add the validation summary. So we'll close everything that we have here. We'll save this and close it as well. Now we need to open up the category for create, and we have the validation for. We can just copy this. We'll go back. Inside our application type, we have create. We'll paste it right after the input tag. If you open up the create here, and if you just copy everything that you see here, and we'll just paste it, we'll make sure this is for application type right here. Changing things will be much simple. We just need application type. Add application type. Name looks good. We do not want the display order. And buttons looks good. Yep. So everything is looking good right here. Next thing is we want to also modify the index for application type. So we can just copy things that we have inside this TD. We'll go back here and we'll paste it right here. The controller name, you can either change this to application type or you can remove it because it is within the same controller. Once you do that changes inside the index, it's time to go to the controller for application type and category. Here we will be dealing with only create, but in future we have to perform edit and delete as well. So why not just copy everything that we have in category controller? We'll copy this, paste it inside the application type controller right here. We'll scroll up, we'll copy the name application type controller, and we'll just delete this. We'll paste it here. There we go. And we'll change to application type. We can change things one by one, but rather than doing that, I would prefer doing the bulk change. There we go. So what we did is we updated everything that we did for category with application type. If we build our project, we shouldn't see any error message. Now we have also added model state inside the post. So let's give that a try. One last thing, we'll close the index. In the create is, if we go to the create for category and application type, we have the validation scripts partial for the client-side validation. So let's give that a try and see if our validations are working. In application type, we'll create, and great, it's working. If we try to edit this, the edit view was not found. So let's add edit view and delete view, and we'll add a plus sign on the index. So we go to the index of category. We have the plus sign here. We'll copy that. and we'll paste that in the index for application type. Next, we want the edit and delete. We can copy these, paste it inside the application type, and we'll modify them. First thing will be the model, which is application type, and we do not want the display order. I believe that's all that we had to change. The action name is delete post, and we have the delete post in application type. Yep, we double check that. Next, we have the edit. So we'll change that to application type, edit application type, and we do not need the display order. This looks good. In delete, we'll change it to delete application type. Let's run our application, and with this, everything should be done for our assignment. Now again, I have been copying and pasting everything, but I hope you do these things from scratch so that you get more exposure to what we just did. Let's try to edit this, and that's working. If we delete, great, everything is working as expected. All the CRUD operations are working now with all the validations. If you are interested in the full course, you can view the details on .NETmastery.com. But I do not like to leave things at this. I want to show you one important step in any web application, which is deployment. Right now, our application is a basic CRUD web application, but still we can deploy our application. So in order to do that, we'll have to go to Azure portal. Here you can sign up for your account. You can get a free account for 12 months. I already have my account, so I will log in. And rather than sign up, it will show me I already have an existing subscription. So I'll log in there, and we are on our portal. You can see I have $200 of remaining credit that you get when you sign up for the first time. In here, whenever you have to deploy anything, you create a resource group. Then in that resource group, we will have to create an app service to host our website, and we will need a database to actually insert all of the data. We can do everything in the portal, or we can switch back to Visual Studio. And in here, if we go on Rocky, let's right click here, and we will select Publish. That will show us all the options that we have to configure. We will select Azure here, we'll select the Windows service. Then you have to make sure you sign in to your account if you are not signed in. So in here, we will be creating a new Azure app service. I'll call the application name as Rocky CRUD, and I already have an Azure subscription, which is the free subscription. Then we have to select the resource group. If you are here for the first time, you will just have to create a new resource group, and you'll have to provide a name. I already have a group, so I will use that. After that, we need to select the hosting plan. We can create a new hosting plan here. And I'll call this Rocky CRUD plan. For size, I will use the free one. We will create this, and that will configure in the existing resource group. For my case, it will create a new hosting plan for our CRUD application. We'll wait for it to get done. Once it completes, in here you see deployment slots. We are not working with slots, but in production application, if you have multiple feature sites, you can use deployment slots here. Let's click Finish. And once you do that, it will show you some of the service dependencies, like it says SQL Server Database. So we will configure the SQL Server Database right here. We will select the Azure SQL Database, and we'll create a new SQL database. I'll call the name as Rocky CRUD DB, and we can select any of the existing server, or I can always create a new server. We'll keep the default location, and for the admin username, you cannot use admin. So I'll use admin user, and password I'm gonna use admin123* with a capital A. So we'll use that and we will create a new SQL database. So with database, we had to create a database server and then we had to create the database. Resource group can be common for both of the database as well as app service. So great, this looks good. Let's hit next here. And we need to configure the connection string name. How do we want to save the connection string? We will go with the none option. I do not want to configure these things. We already know the username is admin user and password is admin123 *. Once you do that, we have the complete connection string right here. So make sure you copy this. We will hit the finish button. That will configure the dependencies and we'll hit the close once it is done. So you can see SQL Server has been configured. Next we will edit the deployment mode here and we need to change the connection string. If you expand the database, here you see the connection string. We will remove this and we will paste the connection string that we copied. We'll select the checkbox to use this connection string at runtime. On top of that, with Entity Framework Core Migrations, if you scroll down, we will paste our connection string here again and we will say apply migrations on publish. That way, if there are any pending migrations, they will be applied. Right now the .NET 5 is in preview version, so we will have to change the deployment mode from framework dependent to self-contained. If you do not make that change, your application will not work. Once we make all of these changes, let's hit the publish. We have the site URL right here, so once it publishes, it will automatically open up this URL and we will see how things look in Azure. Great, so you can see application has been deployed and you see the URL that is on Azure. If you go on category, and in here we can create a new category. Let me try to create one category with display order. And great, you can see it works. All the migrations were applied automatically and we did not have to do anything.